Chapter 6 will be read by my 13-year-old Elisha.
The Littles started out. Mr. Little led the way. Lucy was next. She wore new hiking boots and carried her pepper shaker. Tom walked in front of the cat, and he talked to her all the time. Mrs. Little and Granny Little rode on either side of the cat in the knitted baskets. Hildy the cat carried everyone's pack except Uncle Pete's. Uncle Pete was armed with a bow and arrows as well as his needle sword. He kept telling himself the trip was foolish, but if it was his family wanted to do, he'd go along with it. And they just might need his help if they were in trouble. Hadn't he been an expert bowman during the terrible mouse invasion of 35? When the Littles were out of the house, Mr. Little helped up his hand. "Stop here under this lilac bush," he said.
Lilac bush.
Lilac bush, he said. "You, Tom, climb up the bush and see if the yard is clear to cross." Just as Tom reached the top of the tall lilac bush, he heard a whoosh over his head. It was Cousin Dinky taking off in his glider from the Big's roof. Tom wanted to cheer, but he stopped himself. The Biggs might hear him. Instead, he waved wildly, shaking the top of the bush. Cousin Dinky didn't see Tom until he circled around and flew back over the house. He waved at Tom by dipping the glider's wings. Then he went over the trees and out of sight. Tom could see most of the yard from the lilac bush. None of the Biggs was near. It was Monday morning. Mrs. Big wouldn't be in the house doing her laundry. Mr. Big was at work. The Big to watch out for was Henry. He might be anywhere around the house. And any minute, Henry and his friends might run through the yard like a herd of elephants. Whenever Henry and his friends stormed into the house, Mrs. Big would say, "Henry, I don't want anyone running in the house. If you must act like a herd of elephants, do it in the yard. That is what the yard is for." Tom looked over the yard and decided the coast was clear. Cousin Dinky had told the Littles how to cross the yard. Go from the lilac bush to the black walnut tree, he said. Then go through the flower garden in the yard next door. Cousin Dinky told the Littles to go through the flower gardens whenever they could. He said people taught their pets to stay out of them. "I hope Cousin Dinky knows what he's talking about," thought Tom Little. Tom was worried about the mean-looking dog next door. He hoped the dog had been taught to stay out of the flower garden. Tom couldn't see where the Smalls lived from the lilac bush. But he knew where the house was, though, because he had seen it from the Big's rooftop. There was a woods between the two houses. Cousin Dinky had never been in the woods. He said it was probably full of wild animals. A good place to stay away from, he said. So Cousin Dinky had chosen a way that went around the woods. It was longer, he said, but safer, because it was kept to the yards and gardens. Tom took one more long look to make sure no one was in the yard. Then he climbed down the lilac bush and jumped onto Hildy's neck. "I didn't see anyone," he told his father. "That's a long piece of yard to cross over," said Mr. Little. "Cousin Dinky says it's the worst part of the trip. After this, the rest is easy, he says. Let's try to move extra fast until we get to the walnut tree, way at the back of the yard." "Let's go," said Uncle Pete. "Let's get the show on the road." Mr. Little raised his hand and signaled his family to follow him. They moved from under the lilac bush and into the bright sunlight. The band of tiny people was halfway to the walnut tree when they heard yelling from the other side of the house. It was Henry Big and some of his friends. "Good heavens," said Mr. Little. "It sounds like they're coming this way." Henry Big's voice could be heard above the rest. "I get a pitch, you guys." Just because you have the best yard for playing baseball," said one of the boys. "You think you can tell us what to do?" The voices were growing louder. "This is their ball field," said Tom. "I've watched them play here 1,000 times." Mr. Little stopped in the middle of the yard. He looked to the right and left. "I wish you'd told us that before," he said. "Let Henry pitch," called another boy. "He's got a good screwball." The boys came around the corner of the house. They were tossing a baseball back and forth as they ran into the yard. "Everybody up on Hildy's back," said Mr. Little. He grabbed the loose skin of the cat and pulled himself up. Tom leaned down from Hildy's neck and took Lucy's hand and pulled her up. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Little. "Hold tight, Granny." Uncle Pete, in a hurry, grabbed Hildy by the tail. Meow. Hildy started to slink toward the woods. Uncle Pete finally got on her back. "No, Hildy, no," said Tom. "This way." He pushed and prodded the animal, turning her head by pulling her ears gently. Suddenly, the baseball spun through the air, bounced, and hit the cat on the side. "Eow. Hey, you dummy," yelled Henry Big. "You hit my cat." That was the last thing the Littles heard as Hildy ran from the yard and into the woods.
Uh-oh. That's not good. I don't think they're supposed to go into the woods. Ugh. Those careless boys. Hitting cats with balls. What do you think? Are they going to survive the woods?